Good day. My name is Regina Moore, and I serve as the Executive Minister and CEO of the South Carolina Christian Action Council, the official affiliate of the National Council of Churches based in Washington, D.C. Welcome to a conversation as we prepare to kick off the holiday season that for many of us will be filled with festivities and family gatherings centered around food in one of the world's wealthiest countries. Most of us will eat well during the season while our neighbors will go hungry. If we're honest with ourselves, many of us will overindulge, while some of our neighbors will be hard-pressed to find healthy fruits and vegetables in their community, which is also our community, poked with food deserts. So today we will have the conversation on Manna Matters, liberty, justice, and food security for all. Thank you so much for joining us. Feel free to put your name and your location in the chat. We also thank our partners and colleagues from the Colorado Council of Churches, led by Adrian Miller, the Louisiana Interchurch Conference, led by Lee Rachel, and the North Carolina Council of Churches, led by Jennifer Copeland. We also thank our other Council of Churches colleagues. This conversation came into being after having conversations with my colleagues across the country. We were looking for a common thread in our work. The challenge of food security in the United States is just one of the many common threads. Food security is a legislative matter. It is a justice matter. It is a faith matter, and it is an economic matter. Here to share with us are three leaders who will bring their own perspectives to the conversation. The first is Aaron Johnson. Aaron will give us an overview of the 2022 Farm Bill, parts of its impact on all communities, and the actions faith communities can take. Next, Adrian Miller will share his perspective as one who has worked on legislative matters at the White House, writes about food and the African American culture, and who leads a faith-based organization in Colorado. Finally, Anne Marie Montague will share her experience of leading a food pantry in Eastern North Carolina and how she leverages her relationship with local rural farmers. Finally, we will leave time for Q&A, so make sure you engage in the chat. Let's get started. Aaron Johnson is the program manager for the Challenging Corporate Power Company for Rafa USA in Durham, North Carolina. Aaron grew up in Moline, Illinois, one of the Quad Cities on the Mississippi River. He loved growing up on the river, especially when he was old enough to go duck hunting on the Mississippi. He comes from a family of dairy and hog farmers, where he also learned how to can and juice fruits and vegetables. Aaron went on to earn an undergraduate degree from Taylor University in Upland, Indiana, where he majored in philosophy and professional writing. Following college, he attended Duke University's Divinity School and received a Master of Theological Studies. Early on during his two-year program, he knew he wanted to find work in social justice space and social impact space. He writes, "I worked on a diversified local farm while in divinity school. And this was when I realized I'd love to find my way in food systems social impact work at some point." Aaron enjoys cooking with his family and spending quality time with his partner, Ariane, and their daughter, Sophie. Adrian Miller hails from Colorado and is a lifetime member of Campbell Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Denver, Colorado. Adrian is a graduate of Stanford University and Georgetown University Law School. After practicing law in Denver for several years, Adrian became a special assistant to President Bill Clinton and the deputy director of the President's Initiative for One America. The President's Initiative for One America was the first freestanding White House office in history to examine the focus on closing the opportunity gaps that exist for minorities in this country. After his White House stint, Adrian returned to Colorado and served as the general counsel and director of outreach at the Bell Policy Center, a progressive think tank dedicated to making Colorado a state of opportunity for all. In 2007, Adrian became the deputy legislative director for Colorado Governor Bill Ritter Jr., Adrian was also Governor Ritter's point person on the Colorado campaign to end childhood hunger, which significantly increased participation in the summer food and school breakfast programs. Adrian currently serves as the executive director of the Colorado Council of Churches. He's also the author of the James Beard Foundation award-winning book, Soul Food, The Surprising Story of an American Cuisine, One Plate at a Time. And finally, Anne-Marie Montague is an experienced executive director with a demonstrated history of working in the nonprofit organization management industry. Her skills in nonprofit organization, conflict resolution, fundraising, nonprofit management, and strategic planning have served well in her current role as executive director of the Eagles Wings Pantry in Washington, North Carolina, where she partners with local farmers to meet the challenges of food security for her neighbors. Anne-Marie is a strong business development professional with a Master's of Divinity focused on pastoral care, theology, and scripture from Episcopal Divinity School. Prior to operating in the nonprofit space, Anne-Marie led corporate credit management. She is also a proud Rotarian. So Aaron Johnson, we'll start with you. And I invite you, please share with us about the 2023 Farm Bill. Tell us what it is, what it isn't, key dynamics, and how we can get involved. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Regina, and thanks to all of you for your interest in food policy. As Regina said, I'm Aaron. I'm with the Rural Advancement Foundation International, USA. And just really quick, our work. So we do work within the food system, both in the policy space as well as providing technical assistance for agricultural producers across the country. We challenge the root cause of unjust food systems and support and advocate for economically, racially, and ecologically just farming communities. And the Farm Bill is a huge part of that. So before we talk about this Farm Bill, if we can go ahead a few slides, I want to talk a little bit just about how a Farm Bill becomes law. So this is just a little bit of a primer so we all have the same language. So first, some useful vocabulary. I'm going to be talking about a number of things and using a number of terms. I just want to get these on the table. The first is a marker bill. And I want to think about the Farm Bill process a little bit like building Legos. A marker bill is one Lego piece. A member of Congress might be interested in one of the many issues that are included in the Farm Bill and will write a bill about it. Maybe they care a lot about how a particular conservation program is designed, or they care a lot about how much funding is applied to a particular nutrition program. They write a bill about it and they introduce it into Congress. That bill isn't intended to be passed just as a standalone bill. It's intended to then be on the table, so to speak, as a Lego piece that is all going to get put together into what becomes the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is what we call an omnibus legislation. And what that means is the Farm Bill is basically a monster Lego tower. It is a large multi-part legislative package, and it combines a lot of smaller ideas, these smaller Lego pieces, into a framework that eventually becomes the massive Farm Bill that everyone in Congress votes on. One other key dynamic in Congress is the filibuster. This is at play in the Senate. And the important thing to know about the filibuster is that it's basically a tactic in the Senate that allows any individual member to prevent progress on a bill like the Farm Bill unless 60 members in the chamber agree that a debate and a vote should proceed, which means all that really means is that you have to have 60 of the 100 Senate members supporting a Farm Bill overall for it to even be considered for a vote in the Senate. And that's a pretty high threshold of consensus. And that means that Farm Bills tend to be a pretty compromising kind of middle of the road fight. You have to balance a lot of interests across kind of the ideological spectrum in order to successfully move a Farm Bill forward. Final term we're going to talk about is appropriations, which just refers to Congress deciding how much money they're going to spend. And There are some spending categories like SNAP that are just set as mandatory, and there are other spending categories like spending on agricultural research that then also have to basically be authorized every year as a part of the appropriations process. And this is in the news right now when you see in the news about Congress fighting over the budget and a possible government shutdown. That's the appropriations process. That's what they're fighting about. And that's a separate thing that's happening alongside the Farm Bill, and in some ways is delaying the current Farm Bill process. And they affect each other, but they're not the same thing. The next thing, just really quick, a refresher how this process proceeds in Congress. When we talk about the Farm Bill, when it's being cooked, there's actually two Farm Bills. There's a Farm Bill being written in the House. There's a Farm Bill being written in the Senate, in the agriculture committees of each chamber. And those committees spend a lot of time writing and putting together all of these Lego pieces. They then bring the full piece of legislation to the floor. That hasn't happened yet, by the way, in either the House or the Senate. So we're still in this Farm Bill at the very top of this graphic in terms of process. Eventually, the Senate Ag Committee and the House Ag Committee will both bring a piece of legislation to the floor. Everyone will debate it and either decide to pass it or not. Eventually, once each chamber passes a version of the Farm Bill, they have to come together into what's called a conference committee and hash out the differences between the two bills and harmonize them into one bill that gets sent back to both chambers, voted on again before it can go to the president to be signed. So that's the complicated process of how we get to a final Farm Bill. And then zooming out even a little bit more, the Farm Bill is just one part of the policy process. If you look at this, we're kind of in the pre-authorization and hearings to authorization process. And the Farm Bill process started really as far back as 2021 in terms of the committees were having hearings about different issues. People were starting to introduce marker bills to get ideas on the table. Right now, we're fighting about how to put all those Lego pieces together. Eventually, that will be passed, but that's not the end of the work either. Then certain elements of what's been funded in the Farm Bill will have to be authorized in the appropriations process to actually spend the money. And that will happen every year over the next 5 years. So just because we say that we're going to spend $1 million on this or that in the Farm Bill doesn't mean it'll actually happen unless in the appropriations process that money is actually appropriated. And we have to pay attention to how the executive branch implements all of these policies in the various agencies, including USDA, before we evaluate how the Farm Bill is going and do this all over again in 2028, 2029, or 2030. So that is just kind of a big picture overview of how the policy making timeline works for ag policy. And now we can talk about what the Farm Bill is. It's kind of a big deal. It's a big deal if you care about how we provide for food access in this country. It's a big deal if you care about how we transition our food system to be more climate resilient in the face of climate change or climate chaos. It's a big deal if you care about how our economy decides what different types of food cost what. The subsidies that are included in the Farm Bill have a big impact on whether fruits and vegetables cost X, Y, or Z, or meat, or grains. Those are all affected by Farm Bill policy. And the last time we passed a Farm Bill was in 2018. It has actually already expired in September of this year. So we actually don't have a Farm Bill active right now. It's kind of running on fumes. And we're still in the process of writing a new Farm Bill. We may actually see a Farm Bill extension of the 2018 Farm Bill to give us a little bit more time to write this Farm Bill. And just in big picture terms, this is like $400 to $500 billion piece of legislation that's happening. It's good to be clear about what's in the Farm Bill and what's not. So in the next slide, you'll see some of the things that we do cover in the Farm Bill and some of the things that just aren't a part of the Farm Bill process. And that doesn't mean they're important. It just means that Congress is very unlikely to deal with these policy issues in the Farm Bill versus in a different legislative process. The Farm Bill has SNAP, anything about food assistance, what used to be food stamps, several other nutrition programs. It covers crop insurance and crop subsidies for farmers. Crop insurance protects farmers from risk around weather or their crops not growing as well as they should. We subsidize certain crops to make sure that their production is reliable. We provide farm loans, agricultural credit for farmers to start or maintain operations. We do a lot around conservation, providing funds to invest in or pay farmers to do practices that will take care of the land. The Farm Bill deals with all of our kind of trade policy around food and how we invest in local and regional food systems, how we invest in rural energy projects. So if you care about solar build out, the Farm Bill is important. Um, and how we research the future of how we're going to grow food. That's dealt with in the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill doesn't deal with things like farm worker and labor rights. That doesn't mean it's not important. It's vitally important, but Congress is just not likely to do policy work on that in the Farm Bill. They would do that in a different, legislative fight. Same with school meals; those are authorized separately. Regulation of GMOs, immigration policy. If you care about the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act when it comes to like pollution in the food system, that's a separate piece of legislation, a separate committee that deals with that. So these are some of the splits. And so when we talk about Farm Bill, it's very comprehensive, but it's not fully comprehensive, and it's not where everything related to the food system happens. And so if you care about a particular issue that's in that brown box, and you don't hear me talking about it today, that doesn't mean we don't care about it. It doesn't mean it's not important. It just means that there's a different track to get on to do that policy work. The structure of the Farm Bill is broken up into what are called titles. Each title is kind of the chapter of the overall book of the Farm Bill that deals with a particular type of policy. If we go to the next slide, that just describes really quickly what some of these are. So the commodity title deals with how the government subsidizes different crops like corn or soybeans or rice or peanuts. And as you'll see in a minute, there's some big fights about that. The conservation title has to do with all of the different programs that we have available for farmers to take care of the land and transition their operations towards more climate resilient practices. Super important if you care about climate change. A lot of you are going to care about the nutrition title and SNAP and other nutrition incentives. It's the biggest part of the Farm Bill. The other titles here, credit, rural development, research, these are all things that are really important to farmers, but not necessarily as focused as much in the broadest kind of public conversation about the Farm Bill. We do a lot of work in the credit title because a lot of the policy that happens there affects how farmers, especially farmers of color, are able to access capital for their farms and make sure they're not discriminated against. So that's an important title for us. When we think about climate change, the energy title has a lot of investments into rural energy transition, and that's important. The crop insurance title is a big deal to the overall farm conversation because that's how a lot of farmers manage risk, and that's where some of the policy fights are happening. And the miscellaneous title, it's my favorite title actually, because that is where some of the focus of my work happens around challenging corporate power and dealing with fair competition regulations when it comes to the food system. A lot of the food system is really dominated by a cluster of dominant corporations who often engage in different forms of power abuse, and some of the policy that we're working on to push back against that happens in the miscellaneous title, as well as a lot of programs that specifically are there to help socially disadvantaged and historically marginalized producers. Just to put the Farm Bill in perspective, though, it helps to kind of think about the Farm Bill in terms of how much money is being spent where. And what you'll see in this graph is that SNAP is and nutrition programs are by far the biggest chunk of the Farm Bill in monetary terms. Over 75% of the funding that's going out in the Farm Bill is being spent on SNAP, and that's mandatory funding, which means if you qualify for SNAP, you get SNAP at the rates that that USDA has set. And so that's like a big chunk of the funding that's already spoken for. And then the remaining 25%, the big three other categories that take up that money is crop insurance and commodity subsidies, and then conservation programs and everything else, which is a lot of other policy stuff is happening in that little purple slice. And so if we just look at that quarter of the pizza in the next slide, kind of zoom in on that, again, the commodity programs and the crop insurance programs, those are basically money going to farmers to help make sure that farming is a risky. I see that question about SNAP funding. We can talk about that in a second. No, it did not expire though. Don't worry about that. SNAP is still going. and the money that goes to farmers to manage the risk of farming, because farming is a risky enterprise, and it depends on the weather, it depends on a lot of different things. And but this is also a place where our policy skews outcomes for farmers based on wealth, based on historical factors, and definitely there are like racial equity concerns here. Um, the conservation programs are really important to folks who care about climate change, because these conservation programs are one of the main vehicles that we have to help fund farmers' ability to adapt their operations, to be resilient in the face of climate change, and to contribute less to climate change. So let's talk a little bit about just like some key dynamics and fights in this farm bill cycle. One of them that's dominant is the fact that the basic consensus in Congress is that this will be a flat funded farm bill. And what that means is the Congressional Budget Office tells us, here's how much money we spent in the last year on the last farm bill. We get that same pie and we decide how much we're going to spend on different things. But if we want to spend $50 billion more on research on this, then we have to find that 50 billion by cutting it from somewhere else. If we want to spend 5 million on this particular program for organics, we got to find that 5 million by cutting somewhere else. And so that causes a lot of fights, because a lot of different members of Congress care about different parts of the farm bill and want to take money from other programs they don't care about as much to fund the interests that they have. One of the biggest dividing lines between Republicans and Democrats about this farm bill is how restrictive will be about who can access SNAP. Republicans are not happy with how SNAP has evolved over the past few years, both through changes to the Thrifty Food Plan, which is basically USDA tries to look at what does it cost to feed a family of different sizes in America. And they hadn't updated that in like 50 years until like 2 years ago, which is really important and really great. And it also resulted in a pretty large percentage increase in SNAP expenditures, which again, we should be doing. At least that's my opinion. And that's the opinion of Democrats. Republicans are not happy about that. And so they would like to cut back on the amount of money we expect to spend on SNAP by making it more restrictive in terms of who can access that, which often looks like additional work requirements and barriers to entry to SNAP. And depending on how many you introduce there, you can project how much money you might save in SNAP, and then from the Republican point of view, think about what are the different things we could spend that money on instead. The other thing that has happened over the past couple of years through COVID is that there were some additional policy changes that resulted in more generous benefits during COVID that Democrats would like to see become more permanent, and Republicans definitely don't. Then another key fight is around conservation funds. The Inflation Reduction Act that was passed last year, which was not specifically agriculturally focused, but did have agricultural components, included $20+ billion of extra conservation funding. And Republicans would love to take that money and away from conservation programs to do other things instead. And Democrats really don't want to see that happen. Neither do we. And for both of these things, the biggest kind of rallying call on the Republican side for what to use these funds for instead is to raise reference prices. What does that mean? Reference prices are the trigger for commodity payouts from the commodity program. And the plans that they proposed would likely benefit less than 1% of the wealthiest farmers in the country. And we don't think it's the wisest way to use those funds. We also think that the commodity programs need some key reforms, that they're abused in certain ways right now. But that's these are the contours of like the big picture fights over this farm bill. On the one hand, let's take away money from SNAP or from conservation. Let's raise reference prices so that we get more more subsidy payments for some of the largest farms that are kind of closely tied to corporate interests in the food system. On the other hand, a vision for a farm bill that would make a lot of investments into conservation programs that could improve the food system's impact on climate and make sure that folks have access to the food assistance that they need. The other key dynamic around the Farm Bill is just the drama in Congress right now. So let's talk about Farm Bill timing for a second. Historically, over the past decade or more, one does not simply pass a Farm Bill on time. This isn't going to be the 2023 Farm Bill. That's a pretty consensus view at this point. There are a number of things that have delayed the Farm Bill process. As you may have been aware, there was a lot of drama in the House over the past month. They didn't have a speaker for 20 plus days, which means they literally didn't do anything except vote on different people who wanted to be speaker. We finally have a speaker, Mike Johnson, who is saying that they want to try to pass a Farm Bill by 2023. But just looking at the legislative schedule and the fact that a Farm Bill draft has not even been made public by either committee, that's highly unlikely. The other thing that has delayed this is the appropriations process. You may remember early in the year a fight about a debt ceiling, or what I like to call a spending cliff, a default cliff, and there was a lot of negotiations between the Biden administration and House Republicans about that. They came to agreement. The appropriations process has continued, but then interest in Congress have tried to make big cuts that kind of violate the terms of that initial deal. That's caused drama. And so all that means the appropriations process is taking a lot longer and getting in the way of the ability to also do Farm Bill processes. And so in reality, we're probably not looking at real Farm Bill work happening until 2024. If we're lucky, we'll get a Farm Bill in 2024, or we may not get a Farm Bill until 2025 if they decide to punt until after the election. So that is another thing that's in play. I can talk quick about how to get involved because I'm coming up on my time, and I can also answer questions at the end of the webinar. But if you want to get involved in policy work, a great way is to join our Policy Action Network. I've got links here, and we can put them in the chat as well. This is a great way for you to receive updates from us about our policy work and about developments that are happening and how to reach out to your Congress people. You can also track specific marker bills with our online marker bill tracker. And then I think the one other plug I'll make, especially to faith leaders, is that a lot of these fights that we have every 5 years around the Farm Bill are deeply impacted by deeper cultural narratives we have around who deserves food assistance or the role of corporations in our society and food system. And a lot of that is like deep narrative change work that we're starting to try to convene conversations about, specifically in the Come to the Table program at RAFI, about how do folks in influential positions like faith community leaders lead community conversations about changing some of these deep narratives we have in our society about these issues to build new consensuses around like what a just food system looks like. And I think faith leaders are really well positioned to lead and facilitate some of those conversations. So that's another thing I would plug. I will hand it back to Regina.
Thank you so much, Aaron. Thank you. Friends, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We will discuss questions toward the end. Next, Aaron Miller will share his perspective on food insecurity and how we can engage and get involved. Take it away, Adrian.
Thanks a lot, Regina. Thank you, Aaron, for giving us that context. So we're going to have a little fun. I'm going to talk about the theology of soul food and give some cultural and historical perspective on soul food and the religious themes that underlie it. And then we'll talk about what churches are doing to address food security. But what you'll see is just the backdrop of food weaponized as a means of control over enslaved people, and then also the efforts of enslaved people to fight back against that. And then we'll see this idea of chronic hunger really is a constant theme in African American history. So I'm going to share my screen here, just a moment, so we can get going. And what you'll see is my first book on soul food, The Surprising Story of an American Cuisine, and a typical soul food meal. So for those who are not familiar with soul food, I'm just going to go through it really quickly in the chat. You can affirm what I describe as a food item. You can say amen, snap your fingers, yum, yum, whatever. So typical soul food meal is going to be as entrees, fried chicken, or maybe some kind of fried fish, usually catfish, maybe even chitlins. Okay, there's probably a lot of booze for that, and I know that's not the popular choice, but I had to include that in my book. For side dishes, we've got greens. Most popular greens are collard, kale, mustard, turnip, cabbage. If you discovered kale in the last 5 to 10 years, welcome to the party because we've been eating them for about 300. Black-eyed peas, candy jams, which are sweet potatoes, macaroni and cheese, then also some type of cornbread, usually hot sauce as a condiment, and then some kind of red drink. And you have to understand in soul food, red is a color and a flavor. So African Americans don't get caught up in calling things cherry or strawberry or, raspberry. We just call it red. And I believe red Kool-Aid is the official soul food drink, just my opinion. And then also for dessert, I couldn't settle on one, so I wrote about 4: pound cake, peach cobbler, banana pudding, sweet potato pie. So that's a typical soul food meal. So the question is, I'm Adrian, the soul food scholar. My tagline is dropping knowledge like hot biscuits, and I certainly endeavor to do that in my time here. So one thing is, where does this term soul food come from? And a lot of people say the 1960s, there were these really strong expressions of Black cultural identity. Black is beautiful, the Black Power movement. But actually, the words soul and food were first joined in the English language with Shakespeare. So in his earliest play, The Two Gentlemen of Verona, there are two characters, Julia and Lucetta, talking about this really sexy guy named Proteus. And he walks by in one scene, and Julia says to Lucetta, "Oh, knowest thou not that his looks are my soul's food?" So there's a couple of takeaways. First of all, even in the late 16th century, not unusual for two girlfriends to get together and describe a guy as yummy. The other takeaway is Shakespeare's really using wordplay here, playing the tangible off the intangible. And that starts to get to the heart of the soul concept, the idea that African Americans, because of the centuries of oppression that we've endured, the things that we do are going to be the most elemental and basic expressions of humanity. So for the next 400 years, though, soul food really had a religious connotation. So it meant doing anything to edify your spiritual life. So listening to a sermon, reading scriptures, singing hymns, that was all described as soul food in various media sources. But let's talk about the religious life of the enslaved. So enslaved people did not come here as just spiritual blank sheets, right? They had their own traditional faith practices in West Africa. Typically, quite a few were Muslim. They had converted to Islam due to Arab traders and others coming into the region in the around 1000 AD and after that. And so people were converted to Christianity. And typically, Christianity for the enslaved people was simply this: they were gathered on Sunday mornings and they were told essentially the parts of the Bible that reinforced slavery. So the verse about being the sons of Ham and being accursed and slaves obey your masters, that kind of stuff. They really did not get a full accounting of the gospel. And typically, the enslaved people were put into segregated spaces, especially in urban situations. So they weren't allowed to worship with whites who were practicing the same faith tradition. And a lot of plantation owners, enslavers, were reluctant to have their enslaved people embrace Christianity because that undercut the rationale for slavery. Often it was because these people are not Christians, we're allowed to enslave them. And so there's a lot of different opinions and approaches to slavery. But that's essentially how enslaved life arose for, Christianity arose for enslaved people. When we talk about African Americans, most people trace our roots to this part of West Africa along the western coast. I'm defining West Africa as the band of countries starting with Senegal in the north, going all the way to Angola in the south. And within that region, people had their own, like I mentioned, spiritual traditions and food traditions. The typical West African meal is some kind of savory soup, stew, or sauce that is either served over a starch or alongside a starch. So the first aspect of control we get is during the Middle Passage. This is the crossing of the Atlantic by enslaved people that would take anywhere from 10 to 12 weeks, depending on where people left in West Africa and where people disembarked in the Americas. In the early years of the slave trade, enslaved people were fed rotting European food. So spoiled meat, rotten beans, vegetables, that kind of stuff. So many people died that slavers actually changed their technique and started feeding enslaved people the foods that they were traditionally used to wherever they came from in West Africa. Typically, for a day, enslaved people were allowed just to come up above deck twice. Otherwise, they were cramped below deck in miserable conditions, and they would eat, bathe, and exercise. And that's when a lot of the enslaved rebellions happened, because that was the opportunity to rebel. So another thing that's important to notice here is that only 4% of the roughly 10 to 12 million people that come across the Atlantic during the Atlantic slave trade make their way to British North America, what eventually would become the United States and Canada. So I think this is important to understand, because what I argue is that soul food is really a Western European meal that's been Africanized, influenced by Africans. And then when you go to points south, like the Caribbean, Central America, Latin America, South America, where there's more similarity in climate, it's really more of an African meal with Western European influences. This is a newspaper ad from a Charleston newspaper, May 1st, 1769. I only show you this because it shows that in this ad, it's talking about the enslaved people being from rice country. What we know now is that enslaved people were brought here to build agricultural industries in the Americas, primarily rice and sugarcane, later tobacco, indigo, and cotton. But their expertise in rice farming and other things was exploited in order to build wealth in the Americas. So what you see is as slavery takes root in what would be later become the United States, you see a replication of kind of these foodways from West Africa. Enslaved people, if they were from a place that relied mainly on root crops, they would ask for sweet potatoes or something similar to supplement their diet. Otherwise, people were given rice if they were used to that, and rice. And we see that flourish on the coastal areas of the Carolinas and Georgia, and to some extent in Southern Virginia. But a lot of people were fed ground cornmeal because that was just the easiest thing to get. So people, as an example of this weaponization of food and control, enslaved people typically were given an allotment of food called rations once a week, and that typically was 5 pounds of a starch, and then a couple of pounds of meat, either smoked, dried, pickled, or salted, and then a jug of molasses. So enslaved people had to figure out how to survive by gardening, by foraging, by hunting and fishing in order to supplement that diet. Here's an example of a plantation. This one's outside of South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina. So in the middle, we've got the pasture area. So beyond that would be where they would grow the commodity crop, the indigo, the tobacco, the cotton, whatever it is. I point you to this lower half of the illustration here. You have some upside down numbers. Those were where the enslaved people lived. So those were the slave quarters, quote unquote. Below it says Negro Gardens. And what I want to point out here is that in most situations, enslaved people were allowed to grow their own food. And so they got a plot of land that they could cultivate. This is a lot of times where African ingredients were introduced into the United States, things like okra, watermelon, sorghum, types of eggplant, and other things. And then below that, it says poultry ground. So enslaved people were allowed to raise their own livestock. And so we have situations where we're showing enslaved people exerting some autonomy over their food choices. But on a typical day, enslaved people were awakened right before dawn and fed out of a trough, usually filled with crumbled up cornbread and buttermilk. And they could not use utensils because those were possible weapons. So they had to eat with their hands or a seafood shell. Then that same trough was cleaned out, and then for the midday meal, enslaved people were fed with then cornbread and assortment of vegetables. There may be some meat in there to flavor the vegetables, but it was not an entree as we think of it. And then at the end of the day, after working hard in those fields, they would get the leftovers from that midday meal, and that was called supper. So keep that in mind. Typically, enslaved people did not get access to a lot of meat or things that had prestigious ingredients like white flour and sugar, except for on weekends and holidays. And that really is where the soul food tradition comes out of. It's really that holiday celebration food that starts to become a more extensive part of the diet. So then we fast forward to the 20th century. You've got these jazz artists that are pretty miffed that white jazz artists were getting all of the money and praise for this genre that they thought they created. And so they decided to take this musical genre, jazz, to a place where they thought that white musicians could not mimic the sound. Some of the cadre of those jazz artists was someone like Ray Charles, and I think this album is perfect. Ray Charles plus genius plus soul equals jazz. So that early jazz sound that emerges in the late 1940s and early 1950s that has a gospel tinge is described as soul and funky. And they basically went to the sounds of the rural church, Black church in the South, in order to create this concept called soul. And so that is really where soul food comes from, because first of all, it was soul music, and then it got popularized, and then it was soul music, soul brothers, soul sisters, soul food. So that gives you kind of this kind of churchy background that's going on. So one thing that was prevalent after the Great Awakenings is that you had in rural South, and now actually throughout rural America, you had these things called camp meetings. And these would be multi-day religious festivals with a lot of preaching, but also a lot of eating and other things. Now, this was significant for African Americans because it was a sharp contrast to what they experienced in urban settings and on plantations where they were in segregated worship services. At these camp meetings, given the vastness of the space where it was being held, there was much more social interaction that was allowed. And so this really taps into the Christian idea of radical hospitality, the idea that there's no respecter of persons and that anyone is welcome in this space. So this gave African Americans a taste of the good life that they didn't have to wait to the afterlife for. Because in most of the preaching they got, they're like, look, you're going to be slaves. You have to endure this. You'll enjoy your rewards in the afterlife. But no, these camp meetings gave a hint that no, there's something else that's possible in this reality. So after the Great Migration, millions of African Americans leave the South for other parts of the country, and the church becomes a very important role for them as they get established in communities and need to be fed. So often churches were an important dining option for these migrants because they were coming into crowded cities. Often they lived in spaces that didn't even have a kitchen in their living space. So they would have to either pay to get kitchen privileges or rely on street food or restaurants and churches to get fed. And so it was a very important there. So there was another example of African Americans, besides gardening outside of their slave quarters, people as free people moving to a location and creating these dining options so people could survive. And also soul food restaurants were very important. We know the civil rights movement had a lot of religious leaders, and if people could not meet at a church, often soul food restaurants would house people. So there's Pascal's in Atlanta. This is the original location. It's now got a new location, which is pretty fancy and nice. And then the classic Dookie Chase in New Orleans. If you've never been there, I highly recommend that spot. Another example of African Americans expressing some food sovereignty is the vegan movement. So Black veganism is a thing. And as I researched my book on soul food, I decided to eat my way through the country. I did it so you don't have to. And one of the memorable places I went to was solely vegan in Oakland, California. So moving from left to right, we've got Southern fried tofu, shaped like fried chicken, vegan mac and cheese, and vegan collard greens with a cayenne pepper lemonade. The tofu was expertly fried. It was crispy. It was really good. I would eat again. The vegan mac and cheese, because there's no dairy in vegan, they used almond milk and almond cheese. So not typically what we think of when mac and cheese, not creamy. It was more like a stuffed tortellini. And the collard greens were as good as any collard greens I've ever had. Because, if you know how to season food, you don't really need meat. So this is an example of African Americans saying, we don't have to eat the traditional food in the same way that we have for, decades and even centuries. We can have something different. We can be a nod to traditional forms, but we can have the food the way that we want to. Now, Black churches are getting involved in here. This is Dr. Heber Brown III. He was a pastor in Baltimore area, and he created something called the Black Church Food Network. And he's left his full-time pastor job to just work on this. And essentially, churches are creating gardens, and they're connecting with Black farmers, and they're feeding their communities. Another example, and this is not a Black church, is a church here in Denver that essentially, this is what church is. They recruit homeowners throughout the Denver metro area and persuade them to donate some of their lawn as garden space. People gather to work in the garden, that's church. And then when it's time to harvest, they will work in that garden, harvest the food, and then create a food stand and give it away for free. So those are just two examples of some exciting things that churches are doing. And then even at the Colorado Council of Churches, I've tried to use food to bring people together to think about food justice issues. One was just to have a big interracial potluck supper so we could get people to come together across racial lines and other lines. And also, we're talking to churches that are thinking about how to use the land that they have to create maybe affordable housing or urban farming. So just a few examples, and I'm going to end there. Blessings to you all, and I'll turn it over to Regina.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Wow, I learned so much, and there's yet so much to learn. Finally, we have Anne Marie Montague. Welcome, Anne Marie.
Thank you, Regina. It's a
Good,
pleasure to be here.
Thank you. We've talked about soul food. We've heard about the Farm Bill. You're actually doing the work. You are on the ground and plowing away. You lead Eagle's Wings Food Pantry in Washington, North Carolina. Tell us, and you also work with local farmers. Describe the food insecurity in your community.
Well, first of all, let me give you the big picture. In the United States, they tell us that 14 to 18% of the population is food insecure. Then you come to North Carolina, and it's between 18 and 20% food insecure. But then you come to a poor county like Beaufort County, where we are, and it's between 20 and 23% of the population being food insecure. So we really need to work on this very hard. We've been around now since 1989, and the local churches back then got together and decided that there are several things they needed to work on to make Beaufort County a better place for people to live. And one of the items that they felt that they really could zero in on was food insecurity. And that was back in 1989. That's 34 years ago. So rather than every church having a little food closet, if you will, with a few cans and boxes, etc., the churches worked together and formed Eagle's Wings, because there is strength in numbers. And if if you're a poorer church or a richer church, it all comes into the same pot so that you can serve people well, or better than if you just have a little food closet where you can give them a couple cans of vegetables or something. So that's the way we operated for many, many years, the first 25 years that Eagle's Wings was around. But again, being a rural community in the eastern part of the state and a poor county, we do not have public transportation. And transportation is an issue, a serious issue in Beaufort County. It prevents people from being able to go to the local community college to get job skills. It prevents people from being hired, because who's going to hire someone that can't get to their work because they don't have transportation? So, we have a lot of other issues that support the poverty level that we have in Beaufort County. But food insecurity is such a basic human right. And that is what we work on and target very, very, very seriously here in Washington.
Yes, interesting to bring these communities together. As we say, there is no waste in God's economy. So right. For those of us who are a part of a faith community and wanting to start a pantry, what tips and tricks do you have for faith communities looking to start a food pantry in their community?
Well, again, I'm going to tell you the most important thing you can do is partner. You partner with your other churches. You partner with your other civic communities, such as, I'm big in Rotary, but Kiwanis, all the different service organizations, because that is their mantra. They exist to serve other people. So you work with those people. You work with the companies, the businesses that are in the area. You let people know. You have to market the fact that there is an issue, but you market the fact that if partnering together, they can address that issue and fix it, or at least make it better. That is such an important aspect. You can't just hold your light under the bushel basket. Don't do that. You must reach out. You must let people know, because people want to help. People, I have found most of the time, 99.9% of the people really want to do something, and they want to work together and help and make a difference. And you have to let them know that there's an opportunity for them to do so.
Thank you. It's apparent on your website that you have lots of partners and sponsorships. Tell us what makes these partnerships strong. How is it that they are able to endure?
I think what has really made a difference is that they see us out in the community. You know, for the first 25 years, we had this, organization here in Washington and expected everybody in the county to come to us. Well, when you don't have transportation, and a third of Beaufort County doesn't have private transportation, and there's no public transportation, you have to figure out how can you get the food and the people together. So we started doing a satellite program 6 years ago. Last month was 6 years anniversary that we have done satellites, where we pack up our vans with food. We pack up our laptop computers, and we go out into areas that we know are food deserts, or people are struggling, high poverty rates. And we have 4 satellite locations where we do this. So our partners see us doing this. They see us out there in the community. We're not just sitting here in our little, temple of food pantry here in Washington. We are out there with the people. They see us. We have team t-shirts that we all wear. It shows that we're out there, and they know how their support is being used. We tell people, if you donate to us in Beaufort County, it's going to be used in Beaufort County. And we've actually had grantors come out and check the food boxes we were giving out, the bags of produce. What are you giving? How are you using our funding? They wanted to see for themselves. We are totally transparent, and that is important. People have to see you doing the job, not just talking about it and having your hand out for a donation. They want to see you putting that donation to work.
So you're telling us we need to be transparent in our work, and to be strong in marketing our ministry, and to make sure that we're meeting the needs, know our community, do a little community mapping, know your community so you can meet the needs and meet them where they are.
Yes.
Anne-Marie, will you take a moment and tell us what you love about your work?
I love coming to my office every day. It must be crazy. I'm an old woman, and I'm still working, and I love it, because no matter what we do here, no matter what you're doing, if you're packing produce or you're helping unload a truck load of groceries, or I'm writing a grant, doesn't matter what we do. We know at the end of the day that we're doing some good for someone somewhere. And that is just, to me, that's the whole thing. It's why I'm in Rotary, because Rotary is service above self. In our Christian world, what are we told? What did Jesus tell the disciples? You feed them. You feed them. And when I'm out there preaching, and I go visit different churches, and I tell them this, I quote that gospel story, and I say, you feed them. And that finger is pointing at me and you and every person in that congregation or in that room, doesn't matter, because that's what we are asked to do if we are going to really love our neighbor. And so that's a satisfaction that all of our staff and volunteers have in knowing that we are helping somebody else. We're not doing it for us.
Great, thank you. Anne-Marie Montague with Eagle's Wings Food Pantry. Well, friends, we've come to the time for questions and answers, and I'm gonna call on Rachel, who out of Louisiana, who's been monitoring the chat. Ask everyone, our presenters, to come back on. And as Lee looks through that, one thing I do want, my question to Adrian is, what's the secret to a good collard green dish? I just need one secret.
Wow. So actually, the secret is you just got to cook it till it's tender. There's this myth out there that you just have to have them falling apart and disintegrating, but you just want to cook greens until they're tender. That's the trick. So, if you're doing collards and kale, 45 minutes to an hour. But if you're doing mustard and turnip greens, really half an hour, you should be good. So
I'm gonna give you my mother's number so you can tell her that. All right. Lee, what questions do we have from the good people?
Yeah, it looks like we have questions probably for Aaron about the Farm Bill. There was one earlier while he was talking about the funding for the SNAP program that he briefly answered, but maybe had some more depth to offer there. And then also a question that just came in about the impact of climate on our communities and on our farms and on our bumblebees and things of that sort. And so wondering how that might be reflected in the Farm Bill. So if Aaron has a moment, maybe he could address those.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you, Lee.
So the question previously about SNAP, I think came up when I was talking about how the Farm Bill having expired. When the Farm Bill expires, that doesn't necessarily mean that all work or funding stops. In fact, most of the things that are in the Farm Bill continue rolling on. There are some complicated consequences if they don't extend the Farm Bill by sometime in late December that I won't get into right now, but none of them really impact SNAP necessarily. SNAP will continue to roll on for the foreseeable future, even without a Farm Bill extension, because that's a mandatorily funded program. And then the other question, which I'll try to summarize, won't read all of it, but it was asking both about climate-driven flooding and about kind of tying that to native plant propagation as well as pollinator stuff. And sounds like someone is really interested in kind of like native species as well as pollinator issues. And yes, the Farm Bill definitely has impact on those issues. When it comes to the impact of flooding, for one, for farmers who might be impacted by that, like the crop insurance sections of the Farm Bill and like development of new types of policies in the crop insurance title of the Farm Bill are really relevant to that. But I also hear there like the conservation programs, some of the conservation practices that farmers can be funded to adopt include things like riparian buffers or which is like basically like native planting along a waterway to prevent erosion, a lot of like nitty gritty technical stuff around erosion prevention, which you're kind of talking about when it comes to flooding, or around establishing pollinators. That's actually a conservation practice that you can get funded for that we at RAFI do some technical assistance around for folks. We have a program that does a lot of seeds and breeds work in North Carolina, and among other things has planted like millions of wildflowers across North Carolina. So there's definitely like funding streams in the Farm Bill for activity like that, as well as conservation programs that help farmers adopt practices like that.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And you want me to just keep going with questions about the Farm Bill until I don't have them anymore?
Yeah,
Yes,
there's another.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Lee.
Just another one in the chat about organic food. So sure, go ahead and address that.
Yeah, the organic policy is definitely part of the Farm Bill. And there are a number of bills around the organic program. The organic program is actually also one of the programs that is impacted by the current kind of lapsing of the Farm Bill. Basically, there's an organic cost share program that helps cover the cost of farmers who are trying to transition from conventional to organic that's not currently running because of the expiration of the current Farm Bill. So that is something that's being interfered with right now. But organic policy happens in the horticulture section of the Farm Bill, and so it's highly relevant to organic stuff if you care about that.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Aaron. So friends, we're coming up on our end of our time today. Before we leave, take a minute and find the chat. We want to hear your takeaways. So using one word, one phrase, or one image, what are you taking away from today's webinar? Go ahead and put it in the chat. One word, one phrase, or one image. What's your takeaway from today? Friends, thank you for joining us today. Please visit our websites to learn more about our work. Remember, Hunger and Homelessness Awareness Week is November 11 through 18. Also, remember to connect with the Council of Churches agency near you and get involved. Aaron has given us some great action steps to take. Remember to put your takeaway in the chat. Thank you for our speakers for their expertise, and thank you for our partners across the Council of Churches circle, and thank you for your leadership in your area. Have a wonderful holiday season. Peace and blessings to you all.